World Development Report 2014. Risk and Opportunity. Managing Risk for Development, Managing Risk in Developing Countries, with Erwin Michel Kurjan, Executive Director, Wharton Risk Management and Decision Process Center.
I think first of all, it's important to realize that the nature of risk management has radically changed. Maybe over the past 20 years, from something that used to be fairly technical to something that's becoming more and more strategic. Strategic for you as a person who has to make decisions for your own family, as strategic for your community or even your country. So that's the first piece to recognize. In terms of risk, well, obviously, it depends on what country we're looking at. Different countries face different risk. That's why when you look at most of developing countries, you see some patterns here. Health-related risks are important. Access to water is critical. Then you have many risks related to agriculture, which tends to be obviously the first driver of bringing food to this population. And then another big one that we are starting to discover really now even more than before is the whole spectrum of natural disasters. Think about flood, think about typhoon or storm, think about earthquake, landslide, which have taken more life in developing countries than any other part of the world. So these are, to me, the three big dimensions of risk we have to pay attention to more than ever before. So obviously developing countries faces different type of challenges compared to maybe OECD type countries. The first one, of course, is the knowledge about these risks. What do we know from maybe a scientific perspective on the nature of the risk we are facing? What type of data can these countries and decision makers in these countries access to? And then there are operational obstacles, one of them being often, not always, but often the lack of stable institutional response to these risks. And finally, obviously, the question of who's paying for all of that. How do we reduce exposure in these countries and who's paying for reducing that exposure? So these are kind of very specific characteristics of the challenges in developing countries. That said, there are other challenges that are true for developing countries and OECD-type countries alike. One example is everything related to behavioral biases. We're all human beings. We all have certain biases. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples. One is if I tell you that the probability of a scenario to happen next year is 1%, well, are you going to really pay attention to that risk, or are you rather going to disregard that risk, saying, oh, it's only 1%, so it's very unlikely that will happen, so I can not do anything about that risk. So it's an underestimation of the risk. That's a bias that we have seen in many, many countries. Another one is the short-term view that many decision makers have. All of us have the same bias, again, saying, well, what we can do tomorrow is more important than what we can do a year from now or 5 years from now. So we tend all to focus really our effort on things we need to do tomorrow. The challenge, though, is that for many of these risks, investment will be paid back over time, maybe over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. So just judging the validity or effectiveness of some of these prevention measures based on the short-term return is not going to do the cut. So you really have to think more strategically about the return over a long period of time. So that's a second bias. And a third bias that we've seen both in research but also on the ground is procrastination. So it's a big word basically to say, oh yeah, no, I got it. I'll do it next week. And next week become next month, and then next month become next year, and actually we never do it. So it's not specific to the developing countries. That happen a lot around the world. That happens in Europe. That happen in North and South America as well. But that's another behavioral challenge. So in addition to behavioral challenges, obviously you have the question of financing. Who's going to pay for these risk reduction measures, and who's going to pay after one of these shocks hit the country? Well, how do we pay for reducing the exposure? Think about you buying a new car, and the seller tells you that maybe that car will be safer with 5 airbags versus just one. Or you're buying a new bike, and instead of having just one brake, you have 2 brakes on the bike. Well, it's more risk management, but it's more expensive. So very quickly, in many countries or cities we worked in, the question of the investment up front that needs to be put on the table compared to the return, the benefits of these actions is a big one. It's a big one economically speaking, it's a big one politically speaking. And obviously that balance becomes even more difficult to reach in low-income countries where the money is not here. So many of these countries need to rely on international donors. And up to very recently, most of the money that the international donors will provide to these countries has been after disasters. So it's more easy to convince a donor after a big disaster of the interest of providing that money versus convincing that same donor before disaster that investing in retrofitting schools, for instance, to prevent the death of many children around the world is a good thing. How do you solve that? There are tools to do it. One of them is what we call cost-benefit analysis, basically doing a quantitative analysis of the cost of these mitigation measures or risk reduction measures and balancing that with the benefits over time of these measures. Surprisingly, many of these risk reduction actions are cost effective, or at least we know which ones are cost effective. But the challenge typically is more in the implementation, either because we don't have the money to put up front, or we don't want to see the return of these investments, or because the return will be captured over a long period of time. But the tools exist today to measure that in a more quantitative manners than before. So another way you can learn is actually by looking at how other countries have handled large-scale shocks. So natural disaster could be one of them. And typically the way it's done is a mix of trying to understand what happened, a lot of politics, and also a lot of blame game, or what I've called blame game, trying to find someone who was responsible for it. And that's typically what you see in many countries, OECD and developing countries alike. One example where it did not happen, though, is a, I think, great example. That's the country of Chile in Latin America. So Chile is moving from being a developing country to actually entering the OECD. They just entered the OECD group about 2 years ago. And what's interesting with Chile is that they have suffered a massive earthquake in 2010. Some of you might remember actually the big earthquake in Haiti in 2010 that killed about 250,000 people. People don't remember the much more intense earthquake that happened 3 weeks after the earthquake in Haiti. That earthquake was the 5th strongest earthquake recorded on planet Earth. The earthquake in Chile was so powerful that it actually moved the entire planet Earth. Despite that, only 300 people died in Chile. It's a remarkable story when you think about it. There are 2 reasons why only 300 people died, where in other countries maybe 300,000 people would have died. Chile has a long experience in earthquake, that's one. But more fundamentally, the entire country realized that for their own survival, for their own economic growth potential, they had to tackle their resilience to earthquake. Building codes, new constructions are heavily enforced in Chile. Chile heavily rely on international insurance market to transfer part of that loss to international markets. So when the earthquake happened, not only 300 people died, but the shock was about 20% of the GDP of the country. Any other countries will have had at least a 10-year lag in terms of recovery. A year later, Chile was back on track, growing at 7%. A mix of institutions being put in place, a lot of work that had been done in advance of the earthquake on risk management, and also the leadership of the then President Sebastián Piñera, who realized very quickly that there was not just an earthquake. That earthquake could send Chile to very flat growth, and it did not want that. It wanted Chile to go back on track. So that's a great example of a mixture between top leadership, by the president and his staff, working with civil societies, NGOs, international organizations on the ground over the years, not just after the earthquake, and building that trust across these organizations, relying on some of the cost-benefit analysis studies I mentioned before, and being able to sustain what arguably has been one of the most strongest earthquake ever recorded on the planet.